All right, hey Spanish Springs, this is the last lecture, so it's the lecture notes, pages 16. I'm going to kind of quickly talk about page 16 and then do a bit of a review. More than likely, I'll do a little bit, probably one more video as a review video, okay? All right, so we're continuing on with this idea of federalism. Remember federalism, we got 7 pages, 10 through 16. Are on this huge concept of federalism. So this is something that you're definitely going to want to be comfortable with, all right? In class, we've looked at examples, more current examples, right? We've looked at the historical examples that are in your notes, but this idea of federalism, right? This idea of the Constitution gives certain powers to the federal government, and the Constitution gives certain powers to the state government, right? The separation of powers between the federal governments or the national government and the state governments, all right? And so we continue on today, and today is kind of like a wrap-up of this, and one of the things I would say is that this is a fluid subject, this idea of federalism. We consistently see in the current political debate in 2013, people trying to figure out, or people showing views of the correct interpretation of the Constitution. What is the correct amount of power to the states? What is the correct amount of power to the national or federal government? And this is something that I think that will never go away, and it'll be a continuous debate throughout the American political discourse, American political history, when your children are watching these videos as I lecture, all right? It's going to be something that is always going to be controversial. When the federal government can appropriately step in, when the state government should have that right. All right, so this is something that we need to know the historical discussion, which we've been doing in class of federalism, the reasons why the framers put it into the Constitution, how it's been interpreted from, say, 1789 up until devolution, revolution, and then we look a little more currently and say, look at these current examples of how it's being interpreted, because it's consistently going to be something that is controversial. And one of the things you have to understand is, I think, organizing a human society that best protects the natural rights and at the same time provides enough order so that we can have to use Hobbes's word, a commodious living, a life in which we can enjoy the good things in life, but at the same time be free and have a non-tyrannical government, is something that is going to be, it's a hard thing. I don't think we'll ever get perfect with it, but we like to think that this Constitution kind of outlines the parameters in which the governments we have best protect your natural rights and at the same time provide order in our society. All right? So let's look at page 16. In that first Roman numeral, it talks about non-constitutional reasons for the triumph of the nationalist approach. And so what that's basically saying is that it seems that, or not seems that, it's true that from the beginning of this country, as far as the new Constitution is concerned, in 1789, the federal government has essentially grown. All right? And so these notes are asking, why has the federal government grown? And what the notes talk about is this idea that the United States has become huge. All right? Not only in size, but in population since the founding. And therefore, there are problems that some feel that only a national government can solve. And so people have looked to the federal government, the national government, to solve these national problems. And therefore, when we look to that government to solve problems, the government's going to grow. All right? The other thing is, we live in a global community now too, so there's international problems and things that, again, we expect the federal government, the national government, to address these international problems. Again, there shouldn't be, or there won't be, this lack of communication with the states and the people in the states and the masses, all right? But the federal government has grown because of these international and national problems, all right? Now, also another thing is that the idea that communication and transportation has improved tremendously since 1789. The federal government doesn't seem so far away now, and the communication, I mean, if you think about it, our people that represent us in the House of Representatives, people that represent us in the U.S. Senate, most of these people are coming home weekly to come to their constituents. Now remember, this is a vocab word, that if we elect somebody to represent us, whether it's at the state level or at the national level, we are their constituents. All right, the elected representatives' constituents. And so these people are coming home more frequently, which means there's not this disconnect. Ideally, there's not this disconnect between the people way back in the States and the people back in D.C. Now, you're going to hear criticisms of this idea of inside the Beltway mentality, where people in D.C. aren't connected to the states that they represent. And that may be true. And again, that's part of that current debate that we're having, that we will always have about federalism. All right? But because communication, which is much easier, if you think about the internet, if you think about phones, you know, I guess, I don't know if Twitter and all those things are communication, but I guess in some sense they are, in that our elected representatives will tell us what they're doing at moments, so we have this kind of link to them, all right? People have been more willing to accept the federal government growing because we have this ability to connect with them a little bit more than we did at, say, the founding of this country, where communication was, you know, very, very slow, transportation was very, very slow, and it's just continuously grown. All right? Now the other thing is this, is we've looked at this in class, these historical developments, the New Deal, World War II, the Great Society, right? These were moments in history in which the federal government grew. All right? And whenever a government grows, what it does is these programs like the Great Society, these programs like the New Deal, create constituencies. What that means is people that benefit from the programs. All right? And when you create a program in which people benefit from, now think about this, not only do the constituents benefit, but the elected officials benefit from pleasing their constituents, and they can get reelected. All right? And so there's this huge concept that we're going to really see later in the class, but this idea of once you create a program in which people benefit, whether it be military spending, you know, you think about it, we have private companies that build the planes and the tanks and the bombs, you know, and they feed our troops. Those are constituencies of a government program, right? We also have the New Deal programs that were created, Great Society programs that were created. People benefit from those. And what you're going to see is once a group of people start to benefit from a program, it's very, very hard politically to get rid of that program, all right, because people are benefiting. What you're going to hear a lot of the time is, you know, people are going to call for a decrease in the size and spending of our federal government. And that sounds good, and that may be appropriate action because we don't have money or the program's no good anymore or something like that, but it tends to be politically hard for democratically elected members of Congress because they know that some constituency that votes will demand that those programs, those benefits continue to exist. All right? And that's a huge trend there in D in Roman numeral 1. All right, now, here's the thing. You think about what we've seen now. All right? We've seen this growth of the federal government. Now remember, the other thing is, under the Articles of Confederation, from independence until essentially the new Constitution of 1789, the Articles of Confederation was our social contract. And that put very much decentralized power into the hands of the states. And the states viewed themselves very much as these centers of power, sovereign powers, and they were very reluctant to give power to the national government. When this is created, that mentality of states' rights still continues. But what we've seen is, for the reasons we've kind of outlined already, the federal government has grown throughout American history, American political history. All right? And what we saw is, think about the reactions we saw to that. Think about physics. You know, every action has an opposite and equal reaction. So as we saw the federal government grow from, say, the 1930s until the mid-1970s, you see it grow, and then in the 70s we get new federalism, where there's this reaction. These people are saying, wait a minute, is the growth of the federal government that we've seen in these last 40, 50 years appropriate to the problems of American society? Is it the best way to address our problems? Do we still have states' rights? Do people still have liberties? You know, is the federal government, you know, good or is it bad? And so what we saw is that reaction in the 70s. Remember, new federalism starts with Nixon, continues with Reagan into the 80s, and then devolution revolution is this subset of new federalism in which you saw Republican Congresses get elected. And again, think about that. If we have Republican Congresses elected, what that meant is the American public chose that ideology, chose the things that they were saying when they were running for an election, and liked those things. And so what you saw is you saw the American public at that moment in history say, yeah, or at least a majority of the American public, if they gave the House back to the Republicans, they desired or liked or associated with that idea of, wait a minute, maybe the federal government's too big. Can we run our government in a way that gives power back to the states, that's more efficient, that is better for the American public, all right? And then what I want you guys to understand as far as, because this is the end of Unit 1 and page 16, is this idea is, the big question is, what's the appropriate amount of government at the federal level and the state level? I don't think we'll ever come to a conclusion what is the perfect amount. I think some people will tell you that they have the solution, but if we had the solution, we would be doing it, all right? The big question is, what is the appropriate amount of government at the federal level and the state level, all right? And generally people will say they want government that is closer to them because they can then address that government and get problems that they believe exist solved. And it's a question of, federal government back in D.C., even though for the transportation and communication that's improved, it does seem still, I think for some people, that's a long ways away. And it's hard to get change from that government, all right? And it's easier at the state level. Maybe, all right? I don't know, maybe. But the idea here is that we are going to continuously see federalism as an issue in American political discourse forever, right? The appropriate amount of government. And we will go back and forth to moments in history where we want a little more federal government and moments where we want a little more state government. It's going to fluctuate based upon the context or the times at that moment, all right? So, that being said, let's go back and do a little bit of review for the whole unit, all right? And what I'll do is I'll review until my 20 minutes are up, and then I will stop, okay? All right. So let's go back to page 1 for a minute. And remember this idea. The framers have this dualistic view of human nature. And what that means is they know that human beings and human nature has capacity for great good. But at the same sense, human nature has the capacity for evil. And therefore, knowing that, they wanted to create a government that would take into consideration the dualistic view of human nature. And the other thing is what they want. They knew they didn't want monarchy or oligarchy or the concentration of power in the hands of very few people, because they knew that human tendency would be to take that power and quite possibly abuse that power. And their political experience as British subjects had seen these kind of abusive monarchies throughout human history. All right. Now, the other thing is to go back a little bit more political philosophy is at one point democracy is this kind of dirty word in human history. All right. Democracy was associated with, mob rule. Democracy was associated with chaos and turmoil and all the things we've looked at in class. All right. And so the framers are very, very much radical in their belief of this idea of democracy, all right? And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to find this balance that could have this idea of liberty, a government that protected your liberty, but a government that protected order, because both are necessary for us to live. Both of those are necessary in a government that leads human society, all right? You need some order, but you need your liberties, all right? So they go away from direct democracy. And one of the reasons, you remember, they go away from direct democracy is because they don't trust the people, the masses, completely. All right? Remember, they believe that the masses, meaning the majority of Americans, would be ignorant, meaning not informed in politics and therefore couldn't make decisions. They would be uninformed and therefore couldn't make decisions. They believe that the masses would be more likely to be motivated by impulse, right, or passion, rather than reason or logic. All right? They also believe that the masses would be swayed by demagogues, these well-spoken individuals that could trick people into electing them and then take us down the road to tyranny or something like that. And so what they do is they believe that a republican system with a little r, right? A representative democracy was the best way to get the desires of the masses, the things that the masses wanted, because that was the whole point of this government, right? They felt that a republic could protect people's natural rights and provide order. And what they thought is, they thought that, hey, another thing is they didn't like democracies is this impracticality, is how do you get, tens of millions of people, and now today hundreds of millions of people, to vote on laws on a daily basis? It would be hard. I mean, we have 435 members in the House, we have 100 people in the Senate, we have 50 state legislatures around the country at each state. All right, how would you then take that and get the entire country on a daily basis, everybody over 18 who could vote, to write law, to vote on law, have a discussion of it? They thought that that was impractical. It would, direct democracies would only be good in small political units like, say, ancient Greece and the city-states. All right, so they believed that a republic was the best way to address these issues. And so the idea here is the masses, you and I, choose people to represent us, and they would come from us, and therefore they would have the same desires and the same wishes and the same needs as you and I, and the same desire for this protection of liberty and this desire for order. But they would be educated, they would be informed, and again, this is the framers here, that the elites would be informed, they would be educated, they would have the temperament to make decisions based on reason or logic rather than impulse. All right. And they would not be swayed by demagoguery, all right? These people that could speak and trick you into certain negative actions, all right? Demagoguery is this idea that you are a good speaker, but you use that speaking ability for evil. Not a good speaker to get people to do good in society, all right? And so in some sense, a republic acted as a filter for the desires of the masses. You and I chose people to elect us, and then they would write legislation and make decisions that we thought would be best. And again, excuse me, if they didn't make decisions we liked, we could then replace them through elections. So they didn't have permanent tenure, which is huge, all right? Okay, now, let's assume that we choose a republic. And again on page 1, it talks about the ideas of who has power. And although, let's think about this. I'll joke in class and say, beware the masses, for the reasons I outlined. But then I'll joke and say, beware the elites, because you need to beware of human nature and power. All right? Human nature tends to maybe lead us towards tyranny. All right? And therefore, when you look at the American political landscape today, who has power? Well, Congress has power. The president has power. State governments have power. Interest groups have power. All right? But the masses have power at the same time. When the masses get fired up and are motivated to go vote for or against somebody, they have a say. All right? So what you have to understand is, yes, there's elites that have power in our society, but at the same time, the masses have power when they get fired up and rise up and vote in certain ways. All right? So power is distributed all over in our society, and that's where we get this idea of pluralism, that there are city governments, county governments, state governments, and the national governments, and all of those are places of power to get things done. All right? In the same sense, the elites have power. I mean, Bill Gates is an elite, a non-elected elite. That guy has tremendous political influence, right? Members of Congress, members in the Senate have incredible power because they're writing the laws that then govern us. All right? So power is spread out in American politics. I think what we'll hear is, the conspiracy theorist is that there's, handfuls of people that run everything, all right? I think, and again, this is me speaking here, that it's probably really difficult for a small group of people to control everything, all right, in a society like ours, especially with the free and open press, with the technology that you and I can then, think about what Facebook has done for the masses in politics. Facebook, Twitter, all this social media we can connect, 300 million people in the United States without actually being in the same room or being in the same state. Political movements can rise up throughout this country, I think probably more easily with the advent of the internet and that kind of technology. All right? Let me check the time real quick. All right, so I only have another minute and a half. All right, I didn't bring my watch today. So let's look at really big picture, all right? I think you need to know federalism. You need to know separation of powers, checks and balances, and this idea of constitutionalism or limited government and judicial review, all right? If we look at, what I'll do is I'll just really quickly look at some of Well, let's just go, the court cases, all right? If we have Marbury v. Madison, establishes the power of judicial review, the ability of the court, the Supreme Court, and the lower courts to say what is or what is not constitutional, right? McCulloch v. Maryland, right, establishes the national supremacy of the federal government, which again, don't think that because of McCulloch v. Maryland, the national government always wins. States' rights are absolutely alive in American political discourse, all right? But McCulloch v. Maryland says, okay, one, when the state laws and the federal law come in conflict, at that moment in McCulloch v. Maryland, they said the supremacy clause says the federal government is supreme because the federal government has written laws that are based on the Constitution, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, right? That's complex. And not always the case. We have examples we'll look at next time in which states have won, all right? McCulloch v. Maryland also talks about this idea of implied powers. Remember, implied powers are powers for Congress that are rooted in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause. Implied powers are powers that are not expressly or delegated or enumerated clearly in the Constitution for Congress, but Congress can interpret the Constitution in a loose constructionist or broad manner to say we have that power. And remember in McCulloch v. Maryland that the court said the Congress does have the power to create a national bank. That is an implied power because some of their enumerated powers, regulating commerce, coining money, collecting taxes, are powers that you can say it is necessary and proper to create a national bank to carry out those enumerated powers. All right, so it established implied powers. And remember that the Chief Justice in McCulloch v. Maryland, in Marbury v. Madison, is John Marshall, a Federalist, right? That his political viewpoint was the federal government needed to be stronger, and he was going to interpret this Constitution to give that federal government more power. All right. Now, the third case, the big of the three cases, Gibbons v. Ogden. All right. Congress has the power to regulate commerce. That's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Congress can regulate interstate, foreign, and commerce among the various Indian tribes, is the language in the Constitution. All right. So, in Gibbons v. Ogden, you had a controversy on the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York about who had the power to give the rights to run a ferry service back and forth across the Hudson River. And this is just kind of simply, all right? But the idea was it's interstate commerce because you have New York and New Jersey on this waterway. So Congress had the ability to settle that dispute, which they did. And what John Marshall, again, in Gibbons v. Ogden did is he says, yep, Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And ferrying people, taking people in a ferry, shuttling them back and forth across a river is interstate commerce. And therefore, Congress can decide this debate. They can settle this issue between New York and New Jersey, all right? Hey, extra credit, all right, on this quiz is Martin versus Hunter's lessee is the court case in which the Supreme Court said established the power of judicial review over state actions. Marbury v. Madison said that the Supreme Court and the courts can strike down or uphold federal law or federal action. But Martin versus Hunter's lessee was the first time in which the court said that the laws written by state governments and the actions taken by states are also susceptible to being struck down or upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, which was absolutely controversial at that moment because, you had these states saying, wait a minute, 9 unelected, lifetime appointed judges get to determine whether or not an action taken by a state government, which was democratically elected by the people, they can strike down that law. And there was definitely some controversy around that, all right? But it was established at that moment. All right, so that's it, 1 through 16. Unit 1 done.